Green Hill Zone hadn't always been known for its peaceful weather and lush vegetation. It hadn't always been known for its friendly inhabitants or the wondrous views out to the brilliant blue ocean. It hadn't been known for much at all. Not to say that none of these facts were true. Green Hill was indeed a peaceful place. But in this particular time, it suffered immensely from storms, floods, and all other kinds of natural disasters. None of the inhabitants really knew the cause, and they weren't prepared for any of it either. Hence, it was a dark year for the zone, as many of these Mobians were swept away or even drowned by each flood that struck them, week after week. Due to constant destruction, it seemed that the Green Hill Zone would be forever wiped off the map and unable to recover. Nobody could really grasp how all this damage could be undone, or why it had all happened. The civilians of the area had begun to manage their unfortunate state, regardless, and move up to higher ground, safe from threatening waters. None of them dared move back down, even when the weekly flood passed and the water level dropped. Nor did anybody leave his or her houses. As far as they were concerned, they were in trouble, and they needed help. They needed someone to save them from this constant threat. Problematic as it was, there was no one. There was no one to save them, and from this threat, there was nothing that could be done but wait. Patience was needed in order to wait for the flooding waters to finally pass the civilians of the Green Hill Zone by. And patience was also needed to wait for the coming of age of their hero, who currently needed more saving than any of the current folk would ever need. The rain cascaded down from the gray storm clouds that swirled violently above the troubled lands. Trees were pulled helplessly back and forth by the crazed winds, several branches threatening to snap off and lose themselves to the dark skies. Heavy raindrops came crashing down, plunging into trembling leaf after trembling leaf. The usual green fields of the zone were stained with brown, sloppy mud. Any observer could tell that this was turning out to be a disaster area. And the observer who had just made this claim was currently sitting on the very top of a hill, overlooking the zone. If any inhabitant of the area had come to see this stranger in such circumstances, an uproar would have ensued, for this person was no Mobian. He was not even an animal for that matter. He was a human, a scientist, to be more specific. He had not come from another world, as many Mobians would have claimed. This scientist had come from miles, countries, even continents away. He'd indeed come from half a world away, just to explore the unknown of what had been deemed Mobius. The scientist gave a sigh. Green Hill Zone had looked promising. Upon arriving here, he'd found much to fascinate and amaze him. The civilians had appeared friendly. The weather had rivaled the beauty of Station Square's local beaches, before the freak thunderstorms happened at least. And on top of that, he'd been able to confirm many rumors and discard others. For one, it had been officially decided what the Mobians had actually looked like. Mere whisperings had debated on whether or not these creatures were actually animalistic in appearance. The strongest evidence for this theory up until now had come from Professor Gerald Robotnik's creation of the supposed ultimate life form, said to be based off the appearance of a Mobian. Despite this claim, there had been no recorded image of such a creature, and such data regarding the matter was over almost 40 years old. This evidence was soon found as fraud, especially after Gerald's descent into a vengeful madness. This statement had disappointed the scientist quite deeply. He'd always had faith in such a great man as Gerald. In fact, that man had inspired him many a time to also become a great scientist, to work hard and create wonders, all for the sake of helping people. The scientist rose, as a flash of lightning soon streaked amongst the dark gray skies above, a deep rumble of thunder soon following after. This man knew he would follow in the great Gerald's footsteps and become the greatest scientist of all time. He knew he would surpass his adored grandfather. He swore it on the name as Dr. Ivo Robotnik. It was still raining heavily as Robotnik continued to amble his way through the nearby forest of Green Hill. Though the rain had occasionally been lessening up, before once more plunging down, the scientist knew all too well that another one of the zone's weekly floods would very well be on its way. Despite the thick and tangling vegetation, the doctor managed to slip past quite easily. He was known to be rather skinny for his age. His white lab coat turned raincoat had been stained with flecks of mud around its base as he jogged throughout the drenched forest, droplets of rain trickling down his glasses and making it increasingly difficult to see. Yet he was certain that he was heading in the right direction. He'd built his settlement right where his ship had crash-landed, and according to his calculations, if he'd continue in this direction for another 21 paces and turn northeast, and continue nearly 34 paces in that direction, he would... Robotnik's thought processes came to an abrupt halt as one of his feet were caught somewhere in the undergrowth, and he suddenly tripped over, landing in the soft, squishy mud with a loud splat. The man wasn't one to complain, yet he was somewhat annoyed at the fact that he now definitely could not see a thing, and that his entire lab coat was soaked in mud. Rising steadily, and removing his glasses, Robotnik cleansed them with his gloved fingers. It was all the more easier to rid the lenses of mud. The rain washed them clean in nearly 5 seconds flat. Replacing him on his rather long nose, and sitting up all the way, he turned to see what exactly had tripped him up. Half buried in the mud, it appeared to be a small shrub of sorts. A small, brown shrub, with thick blades of... The doctor rubbed his lenses. That couldn't be right. A small shrub with what seemed to be quills, shivering violently. Was that the wind? Robotnik blinked. That couldn't be right either. Internally, he began recording observations. A small brown shrub with quivering quills, shaking violently, and the quills seemed to be rising and falling, rather quickly, but in a sort of rhythm. The doctor made a sudden inference. This shrub was alive. Hurriedly, he reached over, careful not to break his gloved hands on the spines, and lifted the small creature from the soaked, suffocating mud. Yet, his inference was correct. The creature was alive, and barely breathing, yet it only dimly, very dimly, seems to be conscious. Robotnik blinked, standing up and still holding the creature by its sides. From here, he could plainly see that, from arm's length, it was a hedgehog, a typical Green Hill Mobian hedgehog, and a rather young and exhausted one at that. Despite the general weak appearance of the young creature, the hedgehog's eyes only just remained open, and they did not portray a frightened weakness or sadness. Its eyes were a fierce jade. They were tired, looking, yes, but determined, as if the young creature had been pushing himself continuously to stay awake through this suffocating weather. Robotnik gave a sigh. The creature was still shivering rather violently from the cold. It wore nothing, no shoes, no gloves, no form of clothing at all. He couldn't leave it here, try as he might. Reassuring himself that his base would only be a few minutes away, the scientist gently placed the hedgehog back on the ground and removed his muddy lab coat. He didn't hesitate to wrap the small hedgehog up, regardless of its sharp spines. That coat was a lost cause anyway. Picking up the young creature and tucking it under his arm, Robotnik hurried through the forest once again, picking up from where he had left off in his navigational calculations, and from its new, warm retreat, the hedgehog stared up continuously at its rescuer for a few good minutes, before exhaustion finally swept over it, enough to finally make it slip into unconsciousness. Mud. Mud and water. And rain. Rain, too. Those were the only things he remembered, vaguely well. The images played over and over in his head. The cold and wet ground, stumbling around in the forest, finally to collapse and remain in the mud for chaos knows how long. So, when the young hedgehog reopened his eyes for the first time since falling into unconsciousness, he came to realize that he was in a very different place. His blurry, sleepy eyesight made out something rather different. Instead of a dreary, cloudy sky with the raindrops streaking down into his eyes, there was a ceiling. A gray, metallic ceiling. He'd kind of thought that it was a storm cloud at first. But no. He was clearly inside. There was no rain, and on top of that, he was warm. Something soft had been placed underneath his aching head. He was entirely comfortable, in contrast to his previous state. The hedgehog was tempted to fall back asleep again. He felt safe here, warm and sleepy. But a nagging curiosity had overtaken his young mind. It wasn't out of fear or doubt, merely out of the desire to know what had happened and where he was. So, slowly, he sat up, and his surroundings were soon revealed to him. The young Mobian had never seen such things in his life. Metal things and junk were scattered about the floor. Nuts, bolts, and vine-like wires snaked across the cold steel ground, pouring out of half-completed machines, he guessed. Multicolored lights flickered on and off upon certain machines. Some even made soft whirring or humming sounds. The hedgehog took all this in with great fascination, having never seen these kinds of objects and machinery before. The hedgehog wasn't sure how they all worked, and he wasn't really interested in those facts for that matter. He was interested because they were all something new. Studying his surroundings for another good few minutes, his jade eyes gleaming with interest, his fascination soon dimmed, and his prior excitement faded away. What else was there? The hedgehog glanced down at himself. He sat on a metal table of sorts, a large white pillow formally cushioning his head. A small, gray, woolen blanket had been draped over his small body. It was comfortable, though it was starting to get itchy. He pushed off his covers and carefully swung his legs over the side of the table. His ears perked up suddenly. Jade eyes wide and attentive, he glanced about the area. He thought he'd heard a loud clatter of sorts. It was still echoing a little, right now, throughout the room. He blinked. It was a very big room. His attention focused back to his current goal, reaching the floor. Glancing back down over the side of the table, he swung his legs back and forth rather indecisively. He wondered if this was safe. The floor was appearing further and further away from his dangling feet as he continued to stare downwards, despite the fact that he was leaning forward, his head inches from his knees. What if he broke an arm? A leg? His eyes grew wide, paranoia overcoming his small form. Or every bone in his body! The hedgehog didn't have to wait long to discover the outcome. In fact, as soon as a shiver had traveled down his spine at the very thought of such an injury, his small body became so unsteady, and on top of that, he was already leaning forward considerably far. So, inevitably, he fell forward off the table. And after performing a somersault and a half in mid-fall, landed hard on his head. Pain shot through his hedgehog's skull, and he let out a loud yelp. He quickly sat up, tensing his whole body and gripping his head in pain. A couple of tears spilled over, though he was a little too frustrated to wallow in the despair of his own clumsiness. Still, it didn't mean he hadn't sat there for a few minutes, seething in mild pain and anger. So, he was rudely shocked when a new voice reached him, startlingly nearby.
That was quite a fall.